I have a word to explain the upcoming anime in summer. Renaissance. You know, last season's new anime series was just too insane. Spy Family, Summertime Render, Yaboy Komen, but this season's anime sequels are gonna take over the game. Alright, let's see what we have this summer. Number 1. Subalashi. Number 1. Midbeast Season 2. This is a gorgeous world with the adorable children Rico and Reg as the main character. It tells the story of human exploring the giant hole abyss. I started watching the show on a strong recommendation of my college roommate. He said I would love this type of anime. Yeah, you're right. And I gotta tell you, it really blew me away. You know what? Midbeast is a work with very cute art style telling a dark story. It literally just takes you into a real world of adventure. This is something you won't experience in other adventure anime. Well, Reg also stretches his arm out and he also explosion. You certainly won't be intimidated by watching One Piece and Konosuba. Intimidated by Konosuba. The point of exploring here is not to find treasure, not to become Genshin's treasure hoarders, but to really learn about things that are unknown to human. You will learn more about the backstory of the abyss as you explore with the children. There will be more interesting and exciting stories as the crew travels deeper into the abyss. Before watching the second season, you need to know the season 1 of the anime and the movie Dawn of the Deep Soul, which will make you have a better watching experience. Once you finish watching, you will also Subalashi. Number 2. Yokoso. Jitsuryuku Shijo Shugi no Kyoshitsu. This anime is back after 2017. It tells the story of campus game fights. That's right, it's not a traditional Japanese romantic school story. I'm not talking about a game fight like forming teams to fight real-life Counter-Strike on campus. In the anime, all students have access to enjoy the school's top-notch facilities and resources. But the fact is that only the elite can enjoy everything. It's kind of like a hierarchy of the school. The main character Kiyotaka is a quiet, unassuming boy. He always keeps his distance from the others, but he's smart as fuck. You can basically think of him as the ringleader. Season 2 will continue to revolve around the class trip. Number 3. Jashinjan Doropukiku. Season 3. It's a story of failed revenge. In an accident, Jashinjan, a devil in hell, was summoned to Jinbojo by Yurine. She repeatedly takes revenge on Yurine, but he's bullied by Yurine like every single day. The most interesting part of this anime is seeing Jashinjan get beaten up. You can think of their relationship as Tom and Jerry. There's always something bloody that happens at home, but I can't truly call them family. You will not believe it, but this is my most anticipated anime to watch this season. The second and third season of this series were made possible by fan crowdfunding. We probably wouldn't have seen season 2 without the support of fans. When I first started watching, I thought Jashinjan's tale was just gross, but now I think that's what makes her so charming. Can't wait to see Jashinjan get beaten up. Number 4. Hatalakuma maou-sama, Season 2. I don't know what I'm supposed to say, but there's a fucking second season of this? It tells the story of Saturn being forced to be transported to modern Tokyo after being defeated by the hero. In order to get back, Mao started working at McDonald's to survive. The story is fundamentally different from the other Isekai Devil series. It's kind of like inspirational stories of underdog. This is like a decade-old anime, right? I remember I was just a middle school student. He actually came out with the sequel. Number 5. Love Live Superstar Season 2. It tells the story of 5 girls pursuing their dream of becoming school idols together. But in Season 2, Lila has added 4 members. To be honest, I'm a little curious to see how the story will develop, because Love Live has always been focusing on character building, but the 5 were actually not portrayed well in the first season. I don't know what I should expect. Hopefully those 4 members will bring some new energy to the story. Imagine a writer screw it up. By the way, Aqua 6 Love Live starts next week, and I will show you the Love Live fan event I will be attending in Amoy in my next week's video. Number 6. Duncan ni deai wo motomeru no wa machigate darouga ga. Season 4. Shit, I hate this title. Number 7. Kanojo o karishimasu. Season 2. Kazuya is a simp. Sometimes I even wonder if he's a male or not. Number 8. Overlord Season 4. I thought it was going to air in April and then it was postponed to the summer. And Overlord is undoubtedly a top isekai series. The main character Momonga is a badass. Isn't that a reason enough for you to watch it? Number 9. Kakegurui Twin, my favorite gambling themed anime series. It focuses on the story of Meow before Yumiko came to the school. Shit, it's the story of a doll ass. I'm invested. Number 10. Tokyo Meow Meow New, 20-year-old anime. A story of a girl who got injected with animal DNA to become a magical girl. Don't worry, this is not Magical Madoka or Magical Girl Sai. Sports anime. Shin Tennis Oji-sama, U17 World Cup. Don't take it as serious sports anime. It contains some murder scenarios. Shuto, go to the future. 29-year-old big uncle level soccer anime. I love that anime. Slam Dunk movie. I'm not sure if it's going to air this year. All I've heard is that there's probably a chance it could be released later this year. Probably summer, probably winter, probably it's just a scam. The Slam Dunk series is also one that hasn't shown up in a long time. I'm hoping to see the Nationals. That's what I've been waiting for over 10 years. Alright, these are some upcoming sequels I'm sharing with you guys. I was going to introduce some new anime works, but when I browsed my anime list, I realized they are all fucking isekai. But whether it's a new anime or an anime sequel, if you have a particular anime you'd like to recommend, please leave in a comment and we will get a chance to see great anime works. Thank you so much for watching. My channel is all about anime, films, and games. If you are interested in the content, make sure you drop a like and click subscribe on the right of the video, and I will see you next week.